the Harvard University team of teachers in the next year in a graduate school of design. So in the meantime, he's just finishing his book, and we are told that some of the arguments presented in these 3 sessions this week actually come from the manuscript which is being finalized. So perhaps I could just pass my word to Daniel now, and I hope we will enjoy the presentation.
Could I just not have them on yet, please? Right. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay. Well, first I want to thank you all for the invitation to present my work here today. In particular, I'd like to thank Moisen for having originally suggested such a visit, and Mary Wall for having really made its mechanics possible. I think I'm just going to turn on the slides for power. They're on. Okay. This lecture is really the second of 3 presentations this week, as was just mentioned, that are derived from research I conducted for a manuscript in progress, which I'm tentatively calling an aesthetic occupation, and it's about architecture, politics, and the menace of monuments in Mandate-era Palestine and present-day Israel. These figures that I'm presenting right now are really for tomorrow's talk, but in a vulgar American way, I'm making a plug for yet another lecture. But the book itself is really a political history of Palestine and Israel that is, in a sense, written obliquely from the perspective of architecture. As such, it documents the curious relation between the persistent figuration of architecture as a menace and what a regularized historical narrative has privileged as decisive moments of historical change. Events leading from the Nebi Musa riots of 1920 to the Wailing Wall riots of 1929, even to the archaeological tunnel crisis of recent weeks, and to even these posters of recent years. What emerges in this study is first an argument that in this particular history, the image of architecture, the brandished image of the monument against monument, is necessarily linked with a certain libidinal economy, insofar as it has acted apotropeically as the persistent but ambivalent figure of possession and dispossession. A libidinal economy because the intensity of the investment in such images and the articulation of their position within the discourse of both Zionist and Palestinian Arab political elites reveal their status not only as surrogates for territory, but also for an identity that is erected as if under the burden of a perceived threat. And this is where a certain chiasmus presents itself in the text, and not only because in it I am necessarily led to discuss the monument as the reflection or ambivalent surrogate for a tenuous identity that is itself founded on through techniques of surrogacy or fictive reflections. As with those curious thrones and altars described by Freud in his famous essay on fetishism, those pieces of furniture which he describes, which function as metonymic figures of displacement, and by means of which Freud inadvertently, I think, reveals how a menace may necessarily have to be articulated as a danger to other surrogates. What one encounters in this particular history is a dialectic within which the threat to surrogates occasions and is in turn occasioned by the erection of political surrogates ad infinitum. The second imperative of this study is to analyze the unitary character of this same apotropaic order within Palestine and Israel's specific political culture, recognizing in this fetishism of architecture and in the formal attributes of that surrogacy the mark of another history, which only really presents itself in the negative of its trace. This imperative is really sanctioned, at least in my view, by the curious relation of the apotropaic figure of architecture to those moments of violent historical change that I've just mentioned, the riots, revolts, the mass violence, which formal histories treat as decisive breaks, but cannot acknowledge as instances of a subaltern eruption into hegemony. so they really only acknowledge them as architecture. Now, having introduced the context within which what I'm about to present emerged, I want to assure you that the remainder of my presentation today will not really be a theoretical one, that it has been reformed into something resembling a normative architectural history, and that I'll make every effort not to use the word apotropaic again. Could I have the next two, please? I'll move them myself from time to time, but we can do this time. Is he there? I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself. It's okay. Here I go. I did it. Okay. Now, most of you at the AA are probably familiar with this image. It is, of course, the depiction of the Waisenhof Siedlung, depicted as an Arab village. It was created by new romantic Nazi sympathists in 1934, called the Bund für Deutsche Heimatschutz. What I hope to present to you today is really the legacy or the repercussions of the sentiments that this photograph expresses, the sentiments of depicting the modern as Oriental, as well as the origins of the discourse by means of which such a photographic montage could come into being, the origins of the convergence of aesthetic and racial discourse in the 19th century as, in fact, a form of manifest Orientalism. During the course of my talk, you will see the same image of the Waisenhof as an Arab village appear 3 more times. I've done this not only because it is necessary for the narrative, but also as a marker for you. The first time you see it right now essentially introduces the unrecorded history of its immediate legacy, how the sentiments of this very same photo led to the actual legitimation of modernism as Oriental in the Orient during the 1930s. The second time I show this, the photo will introduce a telescoped and very skeletal history of the discourse that eventually equated modernism with a degenerate Oriental physiognomy. The third time you see the photo, you'll know that I'm returning to the Orient in order to complete a more precise analysis of its effects, of its sentiments' effects there. And the fourth and last time will mark the extension of the history of these same effects, if time permits, to the political present in a region which I'm euphemistically in this essay referring to no man's land. The remainder of my talk should take about 50 minutes, I would hope. Here I go. Now, I'd like to begin with a quote from Richard Palmer's essay, The Flat Roof, a Modernist Controversy. He says, Paul Bonatz wrote a newspaper column in 1926 decrying the Waisenhof Siedlung as looking like a suburb of Jerusalem. The phrase was in the Orientalist vein of criticism of modern architecture. But in the polemical context of the mid-1920s, it may well have acquired racist overtones. In 1929, Schulz Naumburg took up the point in the racist innuendos of his book, The Face of the German House, by juxtaposing a photo of an Oriental village to a view of the Waisenhof. Then, the Bund für Deutsche Heimatschutz in the Stuttgart region, which was particularly incensed by the intrusion of the flat roof into the hills of Württemberg, published in 1934 the notorious faked photograph of the Waisenhof as an Arab village. Now, this is clearly not the doctored photograph of the Waisenhof depicted as a suburb of Jerusalem. This is a contemporary image of a Zionist colony in Mandate-era Palestine called Givat Brenner. In effect, something much closer to being an actual suburb of Jerusalem. This image may, however, in a very real sense, be the doctored photograph's counterpart, a record of the strange perpetuation in the Orient of a political controversy that had raged in Weimar Germany over the Neue Sachlichkeit, or the new objectivity or new practicality in architecture, and especially over its characteristic flat roof. By the mid-1930s, at the time when a modern architecture which had once been considered a German national achievement came to be disparaged in its homeland as an Oriental, and we should read this as Semitic, character of its forms, the same Sachlich architecture, evident in garden suburbs and workers' colonies in Palestine, was consistently presented by refugee German architects as evidence of the progressive character of Zionist state building. And I should mention here that there were at least 8 graduates of the Bauhaus in Palestine in the 1930s, along with a series of other very prominent German modernists whom we never hear from again in the official history of architecture. Figures such as Adolf Rading, who built a house in the Waisenhof Siedlung, Alexander Klein, who Tafuri writes about persistently, Naftali, and many others. having said that, I'm going to go on back to my story, which is that essentially the repercussions in Palestine of the original debate over the flat roof, which Richard Palmer has presented as a signifier of Mediterranean universal culture, and the pitched roof as the opposing sign of a Germanic Heimatkultur, were not, it seems, limited to the mere presence of a series of European modernists intent on presenting the Neue Sachlichkeit as the national style of an emerging Jewish commonwealth. What is perhaps more striking in the case of Palestine is that the discourse used to legitimate modernism as a national or Hebrew architecture seemingly emerged out of a cultural context of New Romanticism and of National Romanticism in Germany. And consequently, it drew upon a series of arguments which had been presented against modern architecture by conservative nationalists back in Germany. Consequently, if in the hostile atmosphere of Germany, the new style, as it was called, could be labeled, quote, a child of other skies by its detractors, and thereby neatly eliding references to its purported unsuitability for the climate of Northern Europe, hints of its inferior physiognomy as the fallen face of German culture, and allusions to its Oriental provenance, then similar positions, based on the relation of climatic rationality and appropriateness of racial expression, were presented by the proponents of this new Hebrew architecture, as it was called, as a means of sanctioning its status in the Orient. More specifically, if the overt racist propaganda of Nazi architects such as Paul Schulz-Naumburg could represent modernist structures as models that, quote, no longer keep us under German skies and on German soil, but displace us to the edge of a desert or into an Oriental setting, that's the end of this quote, the same purported Orientalness was paradoxically inverted by its protagonists in Palestine, into one of the most important justifications for advancing the new style. In the words of one of its advocates, this new architectural practicality enabled the Zionist settler to erect an Oriental house such that a man of Western culture could live in it. Now, the alliance between modernism and the Jewish national reawakening meant that once contemporary architectural discourse in Palestine began cautiously to redeem its object as Oriental, it necessarily incorporated the techniques of representation characteristic of Orientalism itself. That is to say, of what Edward Said has described as the Western practice of regularized writing, vision, and study, dominated by imperatives, perspectives, and ideological biases ostensibly suited to the Orient, in effect of dealing with the Orient by means of its representation. And in this context, I'm really speaking of the kind of romantic vision that would seemingly compel the architect Erich Mendelssohn to orchestrate a 1938 photograph of his Anglo-Palestine bank building in Jerusalem along very similar lines to those employed by David Roberts in his depictions of Jerusalem a century earlier. And speaking of Orientalism, I am also referring to a persistent historical cathexis, an occupation in response to desire for the Oriental, by means of which Zionism's efforts to create a so-called Palestine architecture in the modern idiom necessarily implied a corresponding incorporation of that Oriental difference, of difference as a whole, but only in part. For example, the Arab village was, in a sense, relegated to the edge of the desert by means of what Edward Said has described as a technique of a dispatching technique that rendered it timeless, Arcadian, and which finally postured it into an organic feature of the landscape itself. And in order to make this particular point more explicit, I have to introduce here the figure of Julius Posner, who in 1972 stood right here and talked to you about the mysteries of the Bauhaus and its style. In fact, Posner was drawn to Palestine by Erich Mendelssohn in the early 30s, the important expressionist architect whose work in Palestine I've just shown, and who had himself emigrated to Palestine in the early 1930s. Posner quickly left Mendelssohn and fell in with another crowd of younger architects called the Chug, or Ring, that self-consciously modeled themselves after previous avant-garde groups in Germany. This Palestine Ring, or Chug, produced a series of important exhibitions and publications, and also engaged in presenting their achievements in Europe. Writing in one of their texts entitled La Palestine Juive, Jewish Palestine, Posner described the Palestinian landscape, not its architecture, in this fashion. Finally, one sees the village spread out on the hillside, robust cubes of houses. More noble than the Middle European village, the Arab agglomerations do not disguise or conceal their simple and clear elements within picturesque superpositions. Now, to speak of an operative form of Orientalism in the context of this passage is necessarily to introduce another series of issues related to the promotion of the new practicality in Mandate Palestine. Although this passage by Julius Posner clearly perpetuates a long-standing tradition of representing the Orient as the romantic antithesis of the West, his description of the robust cubes of the Arab village do not only relegate such agglomerations to the status of a natural outcropping, it also implies that in such Oriental forms one may in fact detect the ur-form of the modern itself, that is to say, its mythic prehistory. What is presented as the essence of the Oriental landscape on the left is at least formally also the precise ambition of the modernism on the right, an architecture of simple and clear elementarist compositions, and that does not in any sense obscure its legibility through either a false organicism of picturesque superpositions. For your information, the village on the left is a place named Abu Ghosh, right next to Jerusalem, and the modernist vision is the architectural building blocks project designed by Walter Gropius in 1922. Now, the kind of cautions voiced by Posner against all forms of romantic historicism had, of course, been a critical aspect of the German controversy, as viewed from the perspective of the liberal democratic supporters of the new style, those same modernist figures who found themselves engaged in a cultural contest with the perpetuators of a new romantic, folkish ideology of architectural production that carried on the tradition of, for example, Riel's Land und Leute and the like. For the modernists, the new practicality represented the public image of a new era or a new Germany. And as this pamphlet on the left shows, modernism was represented as the victory of these new values. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that the controversy's terms of reference, the formal opposition between structurally dependent allegories of identity, would pass over into the context within which the Neue Sachlichkeit was advanced in Palestine. Frederick Jameson, in his recent essay on the purloined Marx, speaks beautifully about this, noting that binary oppositions of this kind, for example, between the Heimat architecture being produced by right architects in Germany versus this, travel. They actually travel from place to place and tend to reorganize other collective symbolic relationships in this form as well. And I'll have cause to return to this same point later, but at this moment, what I'd like to point out is that it is equally important to recognize that Posner's admonitions against all forms of picturesque superposition were also delivered in the context of the region, in a setting which had developed its own and distinctive language of roofs as a result of Christian European Zionist building experiments in Palestine. And the existence of these precedents would consequently impel the proponents of the Neue Sachlichkeit to maneuver between, in Palestine, to maneuver between what they perceived to be the unsuitable colonial interpretations of a romantic Occidentalism on one hand, and an even more problematic stylistic Orientalism on the other, between what they perceived to be the exigencies of historical and geographical contingency on one hand, and the autonomy of universal forms on the other. And I'll briefly outline how these alternatives were reviewed by the modernists. First, it's important to note that somewhat differently from its connotations in Germany as a signifier of a specifically Aryan or nativist culture, and as an example of that kind of thinking, you could turn to Philip Stauf's Ruin Houses of 1913. In turn-of-the-century Palestine, the pitched roof, constructed of red Marseille tiles, came to be recognized instead as an emblem of a generalized and increasingly universalized colonial Occidentalism. It became a ubiquitous feature of a post-Crimean War landscape, dotted with millenarian, political, and sometimes overtly strategic European colonies, These were in fact erected after Crimea as part of what were called the Tanzimat, or the capitulations imposed by European powers on the Ottoman Empire. Having said this, however, I don't mean to imply that the pitched roof lost its status as a principal characteristic of peasant or agrarian culture. Quite the opposite, because in fact Zionist settlements from the 1900s to World War I categorically relied on their similarity to these same European colonies of the kind that you see on the left, and principally to those of a very interesting group called the Württemberger Templars, a German Protestant sect that first introduced extensive agricultural programs into Palestinian soil. And the Zionist movement did this precisely in order to convey its contemporary imperative, the establishment of a new Jewish peasant culture, rooted in the land, and what would later be identified by one of its principal theorists, a man by the name Borochov, as a proletarian Zionism. On the left, you see the image of a Templar colony in Jerusalem from 1883, and on the right, I have the wrong slide. It was supposed to be something else. I'll just explain briefly that it was going to be an image of a Zionist settlement in the north called Metula, featuring these red roofs, and I would have shown it to you for the reason that, in fact, it had originally been a Druze village called Untalla, bought outright by the Baron Rothschild from these same Druze at a moment that they went off to fight battles in Lebanon. And the very first thing that the Baron did as making it fit for the new colonists was to erect these same red Marseille tiles roofs on top of the domed Arab construction. Now, supporters of the new style generally sympathized and generally appreciated these earlier Zionist efforts, since ideologically many of them were in perfect sympathy with the idea that architecture could in some sense be proletarianized. They were also only too aware that in Europe itself, modernism had been subject to criticism as a form of art Bolshevism or as a style of labor. Nevertheless, the Western character of the established colonial villages in Palestine caused some supporters of the new style to express skepticism regarding the possibility that what they called an authentic Palestine architecture could be formed from these traditional Occidental forms. Posner once again expressed this concern most clearly, even as he introduced the new practicality as the most appropriate face to a Zionist culture that had to now distinguish itself from the folkish German religion utopias of the Templars in Palestine. Posner says, and I got to tell you that he blushed when I read this translation back to him. He said, "It is not an accident that it is possible to know or recognize a nation by the form of its houses. A convenient example of this is the German Protestant settler in Sharona, who copies his father's estate from his homeland to a foreign land. Jews, by contrast, distance themselves from the traditional and dated forms. They learn to love cleanliness and simplicity, and they free their generations from the memories of the past. The path of the Jew towards modern practicality means that he does not putter about with grandpa's furniture any longer." Now, as I've mentioned, on a tactical level, the new style had to represent itself as the practical alternative between two equally problematic extremes, each of which are depicted in this image of an actual suburb of Jerusalem named Talpiot in 1922. Having relegated the traditional forms of established colonies in Palestine to the status of the alien Occidentalism visible on the left side of the street, it also, for the same reasons, categorically rejected any tendencies towards the romantic Orientalism shown on the right side of the street. And they did this quite economically by equating Orientalism with a corrupt ornamentalism, with what they described as, quote, wrapping the interior of a European house in Oriental garb. Such ornamentation could be, and note the vestiary metaphors, such ornamentation could be condoned in the work of an earlier generation of Jewish architects who had themselves sought out a Hebrew style based on Oriental motifs that they teased out from the Jugendstil architectural forms. But in a modern context, such efforts were represented as artificial and doomed to failure. There was a remarkable elegance to this kind of rhetoric. The standard litany of modernism against ornament was turned against manifest architectural Orientalism, so that Orientalism itself was rendered artificial and finally became the mark of an architecture necessarily foreign to Palestine. Conversely, the rejection of a manifest architectural arabisance of the kind then popular among British and American architects practicing in Palestine became for Zionists the mark of a modern indigenous culture. Mimesis itself is what had to be disavowed at all costs, even as this disavowal was the guarantee of a successful mimetic assimilation in the Orient. And this position was articulated by a contemporary of Posner's named Eugen Ratner, who led a double career as a prominent architect and as an even more prominent Zionist military strategist. His memoirs have basically 4 pages on architecture, and the rest are all about wars. He says, Palestine architects soon forsook the sterile field of imitation. The only plans still drawn up in this style are those by foreign architects, as shown by the new YMCA building in Jerusalem. In the majority of cases, architecture of this type is singularly devoid of character, and these buildings approach as near to an Eastern style as does Hollywood. And incidentally, he's talking about this building, which was the YMCA designed by Arthur Loomis Harmon, whom you may recognize because he's the designer of the Empire State Building. Now, if it became clear to some architects in Palestine that the path towards what they called an authentic and logical Eastern style lay beyond the Scylla of a nostalgic European ruralism and the Charybdis of a celluloid Orientalism, yet having come out of a context within which architecture had been consistently figured as the privileged emblem of racial origin, their own polemics of Sachlichkeit necessarily began to rehearse the language of far more dangerous monsters. When examined closely, the Zionist legitimation for the new style follows the confluence of aesthetic and racial theories forged by German opponents to modernism and seemingly inverts their categories of invective into the positive characteristics of the same new style. The original German discourse, though deeply disturbing and complex, has been documented and analyzed with great sensitivity and insight by others, so I really don't need to discuss it at length here. But what is of importance, as it bears on the history of the new objectivity in Palestine, is the specific development of a physiognomic topos, by means of which proponents of an idealized Germanic architecture depicted the new style as first unorganic and un-German in character, and then oriental and nomadic. In other words, the origins of the logic which permitted one to label the Waisenhof Siedlung either a suburb of Jerusalem or an Arab village. And this requires me to undertake a bit of a digression that will nevertheless bring us back to the effects of the Waisenhof picture, the sentiments that it represents in Palestine. It will also underscore what I consider to be one of the principal points of my talk today, that the idealist and Enlightenment notions of type and character, which had once facilitated a projection of human attributes and physiognomies onto architecture, were by the 19th century, and certainly already by the Weimar, so imbued with presuppositions of eugenic, racial, and Orientalist discourse that it is impossible to speak about them as separate phenomena any longer. As this image from Charles Blanc's 1876 text entitled Grammar of the Arts of Design shows, it is really impossible to speak about architecture as the face of culture without also talking about culture's reading of the architecture of the face. And let me guide you into this strange history by means of the original flat roof, pitched roof debate in Germany, as it has been covered by other architectural historians. And I'm using this image on the right of what was described as the Battle of the Roofs between the conservative Fichstahlgrund and the modernist Unkulturmshütte housing estates in Berlin in 1928, in order to underscore the depth of the political oppositions these roof forms came to represent in popular writings. The opposition between a nativist architecture allied to the pitched roof and the universal Mediterranean forms evoked by the flat did not have its origins in Weimar culture. Both Richard Palmer and Barbara Miller-Lane, for example, trace the origins of the flat roof controversy to the cultural politics of the Second Empire, when Ernst Rudolph associated Germanness with nature and the picturesque, and the engineer with the machine and with the straight line and with placelessness. Palmer takes this history further. to Winkelmann's text, Observations on the Architecture of the Ancients of 1762, and to Winkelmann's invectives against the barbaric pitched roof as he crossed the Alps upon his return from Italy. The figure of Winkelmann is also useful to us in this context in constructing an alternative archaeology to the events described by Palmer and Miller Lane, and certainly to those in Palestine, because it provides a critical link to another figure named Adolphe Quetelet. In developing his own conceptions of the statistically average man, Quetelet, the 19th century Belgian mathematician and social scientist, linked physiognomy with social progress directly, so that the statistical frequency of the occurrence of upright foreheads was perceived to be coeval with the perfection of society. The more flat heads, the more advanced a race would become. And in codifying this presupposition, Quetelet relied on the late 18th century notion of the cranial angle, which emerged precisely from the appropriation by pre-evolutionary Enlightenment anthropologists of exactly that same classicist idealism of Winkelmann. The kind of appropriation carried out by Peter Camper in his 1791 image of the progression of monkeys, blacks to Athenian skulls on the left, and by Robert Knox in a similar image on the right dated 1862. And you should really note here how the Athenian skull finally culminates in architecture and the production of a capital. Francis Galton, the father of modern eugenic theory, was apparently introduced to the works of Quetelet in the 1850s. He elaborated Quetelet's statistical analyses on the principles of type and natural variation into a novel photographic parallel which he called the composite image. These images were created by exposing many samples of a particular eugenic type, as he called them, onto one photographic plate. And they were to serve as irrevocable evidence of the existence of normal and deviant physiognomies. You see a composite portrait of normal Royal Engineers on the right, I guess, and of deviants on the left. I get them mixed up. From 1878. And these are significant to this history in two ways. First, because Galton's photographic transposition of Quetelet's homme moyen, or statistically average man, into the composite image were affected in part through studies of medals of Alexander the Great's head. We're back again to Winkelmann's flat heads of the Mediterranean. And more importantly, because in 1883, he was impressed into constructing the same kinds of generic figures by a London Jewish intellectual named Joseph Jacobs, who was searching by himself for an authentic Jewish physiognomy of what he called the Jewish type. Jacobs would later publish his own interpretations of these figures in 1904. Now, in Germany, Galton's biostatistical racial composites were immediately bound up with the myth of Judaization, what was called a Verjudung, which had already gained a degree of currency in aesthetic and popular writing since Richard Wagner had published his famous essay Judaism and Music, and another essay in the same year called Art and Climate. This Verjudung myth, the belief that German culture was in a state of degeneration and decline due to the rootlessness, to the effect of being cut off from its own traditions, caused by the destructive Jewish spirit, as he called it, is really a critical link for us, as it immediately affiliated degeneracy with specifically racial characteristics of Semitic nomadism, a characteristic which would be internalized in Jewish self-perception as a belief that Jews were in fact nomadic, in a way depicted, for example, by Gustave Doré in his famous drawing of the Wandering Jew, and that this consequently implied the need for a final nomadic adventure represented by the songbook of a Zionist Wandervogel, or hiking club, on the left. And in some sense, in this image, we're really at the crux of the matter as far as Germany was concerned, because here, better than anywhere else, we encounter the strange mimetic convergence at play. Nativism of a folkish Germany, this idea of the Wandervogel, manifests itself unwittingly and mimetically as nomadism, right? These people hike. Conversely, we see the mimetic inversion of the Jew into the German. As Moses Calvary, the founder of the Jewish Wandervogel, the Blau-Weiß, said, "My dreams ripened under pine trees and not under palms." And I should mention to you that both Erich Mendelssohn and Eugen Ratner, the military figure that I mentioned earlier, had been deeply involved in this movement. One of them didn't go. Oh, shoot. This is where things get rough. Let me see. It just seems to be going forward, even though I just want to make it go back.
On the right.
Yeah, I actually, yeah. I hit reverse, but...
That's backwards.
Okay, now what? Should I hit forward? Okay, great. Now let's see what happens. Good. Now, thanks to this confluence of physiognomic types with specific psychological attributes, in 1922, the geographer Hans Gunther constructed a vision of racial types based on Galton's composite images and fashioned them directly into representations of inner nature, as he called them, into something closer to the physiognomic theories of Lavater than Winkelmann, really. In Gunther's work, anthropology and metaphysical categories of beauty and soul conveniently merged, but more importantly for us, the flathead is by this point no longer a Winkelmannian attribute of positive character. It is rather something a lot more. For Gunther, what happens with physiognomy is that the indelible character of what of one's racial soul is now manifested in physiognomy, which means effectively that you can never evolve into something better. You're stuck being degenerate or stuck being advanced. Now, this same Hans Gunther is finally really important to this story because it is from his texts, and in particular from a book called Kleine Rassenkunde des deutschen Volkes of 1922, a brief racial history of the German peoples, which went into 8 printings and was remarkably popular in Germany, that the architect Paul Schulz-Naumburg developed the kind of architectural eugenics advanced in his influential texts such as Kunst und Rasse, Art and Race of 1928, and The Face of German Culture, the Face of the German House of 1929. In these works, he linked the sloped roof that you see on the right with the Germanic physiognomy explicitly, with Heimat forms as the genuine face of Nordic architecture, and he associated this with a kind of people he called settlers. Remember that. He represented the modernist images on the left, in turn, as symbols of, quote, a cultural decadence having its roots in biological causes, conveniently displaying the similarity between Modigliani's figures and these poor unfortunates. This particular kind of argument assumed clear Oriental and anti-Semitic forms when in the late 1920s modern architecture was linked both with nomadism and urban decadence. By means of innuendo, the figure of the wandering and rootless Jew was allied with the forms of the Neue Sachlichkeit, an architecture which, in the words of Schulze and Naumburg, looked like, quote, stationary sleeping cars, and which was, quote, the work of nomads of the metropolis. And in this connection, it would probably be useful to recall Spengler's discussions of the Fellach type in his famous Decline of the West. Now, back to the Waisenhof. It was really in this poisonous atmosphere of the late 1920s that the Bund für Deutsche Heimatschutz in the Stuttgart region made the doctored photograph of the Waisenhof Siedlung as an Arab village and as a suburb of Jerusalem. And it is also in this context that members of a prominent roofers' union were led to call modernists flat heads. The racial and architectural equation is finally completed here. Flache Dach, flat roof, dachlos, roofless, flache Kopf, flathead. Now, it's really interesting because it's really evident that in the case of Francis Galton, this father of eugenics, and likely in the case of the original proponents of this Verjudung myth, or Judaizing myth, that they had been responding, in fact, to a Western migration, a westward migration of an Eastern European proletariat, Jewish proletariat in the 19th century. These Ostjuden, as they were called, were invariably represented as Oriental in character, and their appearance elicited a degree of ambivalence among Jews and Gentiles alike. For example, in 1879, the lawyer and historian of Germany, Heinrich von Treitschke, noted that Jews were, quote, nothing else but German-speaking Orientals. Moreover, at the turn of the century, the politician Walter Rathenau, who was assassinated in 1922, wrote an essay called Hero Israel, which already reflected the depth to which this same pejorative Orientalism had been ingrained within the German Jewish population itself. Rathenau, who incidentally was the model for the protagonist Ulrich in Robert Musil's famous novel The Man Without Qualities, and who was also the man who propelled his father to hire barons to do all the famous works for the AEG, transposed this same pejorative or auto-Orientalism into his own composite image of the Jewish physiognomic type. He says to Jews, "Look at yourselves in the mirror. Nothing, unfortunately, can be done about the fact that all of you look frighteningly alike. Neither will it console you that in the first place your East Mediterranean appearance is not very well appreciated by the northern tribes. As soon as you recognize these faults, you will resolve to dedicate a few generations to the renewal of your outer appearance." Now, Rathenau could not have been aware that this is exactly what Joseph Jacobs, the man who approached Galton in 1883 for a composite image of the Jewish type, had actually been seeking to do, though clearly not in a way that would have met with Rathenau's approval. Despite the fact that Galton categorized his Jewish street urchins as eugenically unfit, Jacobs saw in these generic images something else, the redemption of the Oriental as the biblical. And he noted, in these Jewish composites, we have the nearest representation we can hope to possess of the youthful David when he tended his father's sheep. This is a critical moment because Jacobs' photos represent the contemporary transposition of Orientalism into what Paul Mendes Flohr has described as an aesthetic of self-affirmation, Judaism's own new romanticism, its own folkish sentiments. In turn-of-the-century Germany, this same cultural retransformation would be nurtured in particular by the philosopher Martin Buber, whose very influential article of 1912 entitled The Spirit of the Orient in Judaism melded Schopenhauer's belief in the soulless rationalism of the West with notions of a Jewish spirituality, which, in his words, represented a passionate and unyielding quest of the Oriental for unity. And nowhere was this Orientalism as a form of aesthetic self-affirmation so explicitly advanced as in the ubiquitous representations of the face of Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism. A recent study of Herzl's image in Zionist popular culture concludes, without any reference to the strange cranial history that I've just outlined, that, quote, Herzl's physiognomy was the purest symbol of Zionist aspirations, the specific countenance of the movement. A similar sentiment is expressed by Sigmund Freud when he recounts a dream that he had had about none other than Herzl, stating that he was in fact a majestic figure with a pale, dark-toned face framed by a beautiful raven-black beard with infinitely sad eyes. Now, in Palestine, what followed from this phenomenon immediately prior to World War I was an explosion of manifest aesthetic Orientalist techniques in the arts and letters. These expressions ranged from the revival of a Hebrew arts and crafts movement in Palestine, which employed only Oriental motifs and restricted the use of models to Yemenite figures, indicated by the postcard from the Bezalel school on the right. And these also ranged to the creation of a new Hebrew poetry by Bialik and others, and finally to early efforts to create a Zionist culture of building along Eastern lines by architects such as the German Alexander Berwald and Joseph Minor. The latter built the poet Bialik's house, this is it, in Tel Aviv in 1924 as an Orientalist fantasy, and it was in reference to this same building that the modernists in the 30s called such efforts the wrapping of an Occidental house in Oriental garb. Now, reintroducing the same physiognomic topos, Eric Mendelsohn argued similarly that to copy manifest Oriental models in this particular fashion would be to perpetrate, in his words, a masquerade. Now, during the mid-1930s, I apologize for how bad these slides are, but during the mid-1930s, Hebrew architectural publications in Mandate-era Palestine seldom referred explicitly to the political circumstances in which modern architecture had been implicated in contemporary Germany. However, as the article from which the slide on the left intimates, the structure of the controversy clearly permeated the discourse of modernism there. precisely through interconnected categories of climatic rationality as a kind of social Darwinism, of orthographic conceptions of architecture as the face of culture, and principally of an Orientalism linked to rootlessness by means of which racist attacks had been leveled against modernism in Germany. This was really the baggage of the Sachlichkeit modernist in Palestine, that of becoming either authentically Oriental or of becoming good Germans. In Mandate-era Palestine, climatic and technical arguments for the new style were really frequently presented in the context of more general assessments regarding the task of Zionist planning. At the heart of these evaluations was a frequently voiced perception among architects that the task of planning the Zionist settlements was made more difficult by the unprecedented and revolutionary character of such an effort, and in part to the tragic history of nomadism, which they believed to have precluded any viable Jewish culture of building. In the face of this perceived reality, in 1933, architects such as Heinrich Naumann, who did the article on the left, looked about them to Arab precedents and sought to advance modernism as a reconciliation with them, arguing in essence that modernism's flat roof exhibited nebulous special advantages, as he calls them, in the warm climate of Palestine. Similarly, if we look to the slide on the right, this is a study undertaken by Alexander Klein, the same important modernist figure in Germany who Tafuri wrote about. Klein opposed what he described as modernist Mediterranean subtropic elevations on top to modernist Nordic and Germanic ones on the bottom. The former were deemed okay for Palestine and the latter not. And the more polemical advocates of the new Palestine architecture expressed the relationship between climate and national expression and the status of the Neue Sachlichkeit in the Orient more explicitly. Eugen Ratner argued, for example, that Zionism would be judged by its achievements in the field of architecture, much as, quote, we ourselves are apt to base our opinions of ancient Egypt and Rome, and modern New York, for that matter, on the external forms in which the ideals and character of their peoples have been manifested. The same face of culture argument was exactly the one that was presented by Hitler in his 1934 art speeches, using exactly the same models. In Ratner's vision, a Palestine national architecture could emerge precisely from the fact that the unclothing of architecture, what he called the shedding of traditional rigid form, enabled a better adjustment to climatic requirements, and that architects who worked in the modern idiom were nevertheless capable of making use of, quote, certain essential principles underlying the traditional Oriental style. And I showed two examples of these efforts, one by Sharon on the left, who was a graduate of the Bauhaus, and another one by an architect named Neufeld. From Ratner's commonly held conception that the new practicality could extract the, quote, essential principles of Oriental architecture without becoming, in some sense, dependent on its sappy illusions, it was a relatively short step to a far more comprehensive argument advanced by Julius Posner, that precisely because modern architecture was believed to be capable of assimilating what was essential in Oriental construction, it already necessarily represented the authentic and progressive Oriental architecture of a modern era. Posner articulated this same argument in an article entitled One Family Houses in Palestine, presenting a concise history, that's what you see on the left, presenting a concise history of what he calls Mediterranean typologies, beginning with houses in Praini on the right and ending with a house in Mamluk Cairo. Posner argued that the essential Mediterranean partie benefited from the climatic advantages of an open atrium with open rooms facing it. He then explains that in the period directly preceding the development of the typical medieval Egyptian house, urban pressures led to the disappearance of the same open atrium and to the emergence of an internal central hall instead. By the 9th century, Posner notes, this development led to the appearance of what was then called the Arab plan, prevalent in Palestine, which he, however, had successfully exposed in his view as an aberration that had, in a sense, already been corrected by European modernism. Speaking about the same Arab plan, Posner tells us, this reduced plan necessarily developed from crowded urban conditions, And today we could return to it some of its original lines or principles by elevating the living court to the top floor and by transforming the entry-level hall into an open garden once again. Several of the well-known suggestions of Le Corbusier, and he's referring here obviously to the 5 points, are clearer in this respect to Oriental or to Mediterranean conceptions of the dwelling than all of the experiments which have been effected in these countries in our time. On the right you see a dwelling in Tel Aviv. It's not Le Corbusier, done by a man by the name of Barkai, who had actually worked with Corbu on the Villa Church. Now finally, there simply remains the question of nomadism, one of the most perplexing aspects of this story. Posner's rejection of all forms of self-conscious Orientalism did not only rehabilitate the new style by converting it into a more authentic Oriental architecture than many indigenous forms. Paradoxically, having expended an immense effort in order to render the alien indigenous and the indigenous alien, proponents of the Neue Sachlichkeit in Palestine also sought to elevate what had been presented as its purported rootlessness by the Nazi sympathists and the progenitors of the Verjudung myth into one of its principal advantages. For the Zionist architect, modernism was in a sense necessarily the indigenous architecture of the Jewish people, precisely because it reflected what they themselves had represented as the race's earlier nomadic history, its diasporic adventure. As such, the disciplinary character of modernism, the unity of expression it imposed upon builders, assumed for them the status of an ethical principle, which in Ratner's words, warded off chaos and gave a common cultural medium of expression to what was at one time, in his words, little more than a Levantine mixture of European and American architectural influences. It is in this sense, finally, that for a short period, the new building realized the most contemptible accusations of its detractors, and that architecture and the architecture of the flat roof became the architecture of those who had perceived themselves to have been roofless. If I could just have the lights on for one moment, please. Is it possible? From here? From there? I realize that we were delayed, and I won't hold it against you if you just decide not to let me show you the last images of the occupied territories. It's really up to you. I'm okay to stop right now and answer a few questions, and we'll just go have a beer. Yeah? No? You sure? Okay. Okay. Are you sure now? Okay.
Not quite sure.
Yeah.
Depends on the style.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I'd like to end by means of this speculative conclusion, right? This series of images that sketch out for you the boundaries of a no man's land that, in my view, represents the legacy of the tales of roofs and rooflessness that I just told you today on current conceptions of where and what home is. Before I do this, I want to make it clear that what I'm trying to show by means of this strange history of reversals in signification is that symbolic regimes are clearly never stable, and that shifts in signification of this kind always occur, as many figures besides myself have noted, in the context of crisis. In order that I guarantee that I not misconvey my position by what I am about to show you now, I also want to make it clear that what I mean by this is that really neither the pitched roof nor the flat roof mean anything. They mean no specific thing. And I'll refer for the last time to the allegorical aspect of what has emerged in previous critical theory as structural elements. To paraphrase Jameson for the last time, and it's only because I'm a couple of offices away this year, what I am suggesting here is that privileged political investments, these architectural forms, the flat and the pitched, for example, operate according to a formal rather than a content-oriented dynamic. They are able to absorb and refract various new political connotations and oppositions, at the same time as they also, in another sense, conceal and complexify the survival of the older residual images and attitudes. The point to be made, however, is not that all such mappings of political difference are arbitrary, far from it, or subjective, far from it, but they are the inevitable allegorical grids through which we necessarily read the world. They are determined. Simply expressed, don't be surprised when I show you that the same modernist forms which might have once been redeemed during the Mandate era by Jews as progressive and oriental, can once again, in this no man's land under tenuous Jewish sovereignty, connote transiency and a faceless urban culture, much as they once did for those who call the Waisenhof an Arab village. The following examples are all drawn from a magazine named Nekuda, the official organ of the settlement movement, which has religious national settlement movement in the occupied territories, which has elided the imperative to settle this land with a religious mission of national redemption, ideologically. For this movement, the modern is now alien. The modern city is a jungle of cubes. From Nekuda, issue number 25, on the left, we read, the caption of this image reads, "The city as a jungle of urban building. The designers of urban settlements in the beginning and middle of the century didn't design an appropriate infrastructure. The result is a chaos of styles and a surrender to economic and political interests." By contrast, the caption to the image on the bottom on the left reads, "The rural settlement depicted below once had a special character. However, in the middle of the century, it also became a city of cubes without style and character. In other words, it lost face." Now, note here how the precise figures that were established by Ratner are inverted. The box-like unity of modernism is now no longer an ethical force or an organic form linked with the soil, but becomes the signifier of specifically an alien and fallen culture. By contrast, if you look to the advertisement for a new settlement on the right, you can see that another form of dwelling, another picture of home with a pitched roof, is elided with a kind of manifest destiny symbolized by the Torah scroll on the bottom as part of a fundamentalist mission to place approximately 30 to 100 Jewish families on a mountaintop directly above a Palestinian city of 100,000 people. Now, these inversions, I'd like to suggest, signal a crisis of connotation insofar as architecture is concerned. The same modernism which could, by its purported similarity to the Oriental village, legitimate their own settlements as biblical, something that they articulate all the time in Nekuda as being a desire, is also for them the architecture of what Schulze and Naumburg called the stationary sleeping cars of the urban nomads, an architecture of transience. And this is why. Because this impression is compounded by the fact that all their settlements are at first, for strategic reasons, actually composed of stationary sleeping cars. In Hebrew, ashkubiot, or karavanim, seen in the foreground and the photograph on the right, and which consequently had to either be replaced by the figures on the back, or made to signify the principal imperative of the movement, permanence, by means of what you see on the left. These were originally little caravans on which were added the pitched roofs, so that through this mechanism the nomad is turned into a settler. There is also another purpose for this reversal. The cultural politics by means of which a sea of red roofs is now becoming visible in this particular patch of no man's land, a patch of that is often advertised in the pages of Nekuda as a luxury suburb, necessarily relies on the fact that this new signifier of permanence is capable of exposing its hegemonic, in other words, its dominative function, even as it simultaneously renders it transparent. It becomes a strategic embellishment, really. Today, as they face east, the red roofs necessarily establish an opposition between the architecture of those on top, which you see right here, and the architecture of those on the bottom. As they face west towards the center of global culture, these pitched roofs practice a kind of architectural camouflage that makes them appear to signify nothing other than the banality of suburban sprawl, which we all recognize. And in that instance, it's probably good for me to translate this advertisement from Nekuda. It's actually for prefabricated villas, and it says, "A villa is within your reach." In other words, now you too can live in a suburban villa. It just happens to be where it is. Now, by contrast, looking to the architecture of those on the bottom of the picture, there is also an aesthetic worth describing, albeit briefly, as it engages a series of ironic reversals of the physiognomic topos that I described before. From the perspective of its inhabitants, we are really speaking of this no man's land where After the War of 1948, the writer Arif al-Arif made the image of the mutilated body into an allegorical figure of the Palestinian nation in exile. Arif introduced this image of the Palestinian body politic as an amputee in a history of the Palestinian diaspora, or what led right before it, called al-Nakba, or the disaster. And also in another book called al-Nakba fi Sur, the disaster in pictures, which is what this is drawn from. And since then, this topos has been elaborated by various people in Palestinian arts and letters. For example, in this gallery of Palestinian art in East Jerusalem, Palestinian resistance art in East Jerusalem, it is now modestly transformed into an aesthetic that presents itself as an architecture seemingly supported by prosthetic elements. In effect, a kind of Palestinian diaspora aesthetic which seeks to represent both a political dismemberment as well as the progressive character of a nationalist movement by alluding to the similarly dismembered and seemingly destabilizing architectural practices in the West, those styles which came just before the most fashionable architecture of today, something like that. In effect, what I'm trying to say, and with this I'm really going to finish, with a kind of admonition really, there is a sense in which I'd like to urge that that we see the current situation there as one not so far removed from that in our own homes. By aligning themselves with two ubiquitous images from our architectural culture, that of the everyday on the left and that of the trend directly before the latest trend on the right, these simulacra of the West and the Orient may seemingly incite the uncomfortable resurgence of what someone whom I much admire has labeled the architectural uncanny. In other words, they may allude to the unhomely characteristics of our own homes that might have remained repressed were they not somehow brought to light by their duplication in this no man's land. A calculated affiliation with Western suburban culture could not have been made by the current proponents of the pitched roof in no man's land, nor would it be of any use to them if our own suburban architectural practices did not already simultaneously codify and at the same time render absolutely natural a regimented segregation of populations on the basis of class, gender, and race, right? Similarly, in their sensitive political context, the proponents of the so-called resistance aesthetic in no man's land would not be allowed to invoke the formerly hyper-cool architecture of Himmelblau if Himmelblau's self-declared revolutionary intentions weren't at the same time nothing more than a way of safely transmuting the call for the explosion of institutions and their architecture into nothing other than a comfortable aesthetic of instability and danger. Himmelblau's efforts perpetually reenact what Adorno described as the affirmative character of culture. So that caught in this fashion between the latent tyranny of the everyday and the seeming quietism of a fleeting aesthetic of revolutionary explosion, one is tempted to ask if the metaphoric and real suburbs of Jerusalem that I presented today weren't really always just catching up with techniques perfected here. And I'm of course referring to the dialectics of a politicized art and of an aestheticized politics discussed by Benjamin and others. So that if that's the case, then one would have to ask whether we're not all kind of living in this suburb of Jerusalem. Thanks. I cannot hear you, I'm sorry.
I didn't understand the idea that why in the settlements it was flat roofs and not fixed roof, and then it's fixed roof and not flat roof, and that is why they didn't take the German style, which is the fixed roof. I think because it, and you said that they turned to simplicity. I think that they didn't turn to simplicity. They didn't have anything to start with. So they took simplicity as a start, because if you look at the that must be taken into consideration.
Well, I'd like to answer that very specifically. If there was any kind of, perhaps you and I should go over the text after this line by line, because I think I've been extremely careful in representing what they were saying. I'm not presenting this, for example, when you say the questions of simplicity or the question of oriental, I'm talking specifically of the way that they were representing this. This is in the first case. In the second case, the issues that you're raising about how to refer to this architecture and what it is that they had and didn't have is itself nothing more than a perpetuation of the polemic. And I agree with the necessity of this. But on the other hand, what I'm trying to present here, what I'm trying to historicize here, is precisely something that you described, is a situation in which identity is effectively constructed through surrogates. So that when you insist on this reference that I should call this Muslim architecture or Islamic architecture, this would be, in fact, to misrepresent the way that they were, in fact, constructing their identity through surrogates. Okay, that's whichever you want to call them. The other point that I'd like to make is that if this is, in fact, the conclusion to be drawn, the conclusion that I draw is that there is no other alternative to construction of a kind of national identity than precisely through these kinds of invented, constructed forms. It would not be any more authentic, even if I used your terms, at least in my view. I have great sympathy with what you're saying in terms of the exact correct references to specific origins, but I'm representing not the history of what is happening, but the way in which it was polemicized. And that is a significant difference. God, I hope I didn't scare anybody else from asking a question. Yeah. Yeah.
I find it extremely interesting to show that there's no way to escape the realm of what I find interesting here, the reflection that, or what is clear, that there was no possibility to escape that the architecture would be loaded with meaning already from the start, and then makes these kind of attempts by Posner and Mendelssohn and so on to reconstruct a functionalist, rational, was kind of totally overdetermined, overshadowed by the urgent need of a new Israeli state to constitute itself as a nationalist agenda within a kind of hostile environment, within it, and with its own kind of hostile nationalism. So that I find it extremely interesting, and also what struck me that the way the kind of imposed identity it was kind of received and taken on and turned into a positive, self-affirmation through the same series of aesthetic values seems to be, and that after you could say a kind of fairly completed integration over an extended period of the Jewish people into German society, where this kind of the traces were nearly totally lost, would kind of be such an irresistible force to where this integration collapsed. I would try to draw parallels to the kind of politics of difference and identity, which is just going around the kind of path which black liberation into black nationalism, and also within feminist discourse of a failed and defeated integration is actually precisely taking on board all the prejudice, all the kind of constructed and imposed identities as a positive value, because there seems to be no other way.
Yeah, but
because integration is kind of cut off. And so
I agree with the necessity to, in fact, the text of the book does exactly what you're talking about in terms of in what sense it is possible to conceive of this dynamic in relation to other similar epistemes, and in particular, the book works extensively through the whole question of a post-colonial episteme, something which I've written about elsewhere. And the fact is that the conclusion that I come to is, once again, to reiterate, at least in another form, what I was just trying to discuss earlier, is that, in effect, it's not really about taking on precisely which is denigrated in some sense as a means of a project of affirmation. That historically is partly true in their own self-perception. But with a critical distance from that phenomenon, the conclusion that I come to is different, is that integration always fails. That integration always fails. The essence of identity is effectively that failure. That's why I keep on referring to these as allegorical, because allegories never succeed. And in effect, this is where, if you're asking me exactly where it is that in terms of my critical affiliations, this, not necessarily political affiliations, this project lies. It lies, and it's a long story, but it lies basically beginning with this question of the post-colonial, recognizing that in that question of identity, as Homi Bhabha and others have written, there's a very strong engagement with a post-feminist, post-Lacanian, right, episteme, where essentially the entry into subjectivity is necessarily a phenomenal loss, irrevocably a phenomenal loss. But I go further, it seems to, at least I think I like to go further, in saying that this is not simply just the way it is, as some element of hybridity, as some element of dualism, of double articulation, all of these terms that Bhabha uses. I argue that in fact the extremity that eludes the concept always returns as a contradiction, and that's negative dialectics. So where it takes me is to Adorno. And that's tomorrow's talk. Yeah.
Which is perhaps sort of addressing the issue in a more historical sense. Okay, you throw the reference to Corb.
To who?
To
Corbier, yeah.
Towards the end of your presentation.
Posner does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, yes, Posner did, and in a way.
I have to be really careful here. Yeah.
Yes. Now, I wanted to ask a question because of the whole discourse of the East as it appears in his journey to the East. Dependence of the core discourse on the house, on the Oriental house, which in a way, in kind of historiography of modernism, is presented in a more positive sense. Okay, that's like presented like a happy marriage,
right?
Oriental house and the discourse of core and the Corbian house. How do you read that situation in comparison to yours?
It's a very good question, because historically, I've looked for this, and really what happens is that, and this is where doing research on these marginal modernist settings is really useful, it seems to me. I mean, I would really love it if one of you would go out there and write the history of Ernst Mayr in Equatorial East Africa, something that no one's done. Or Bruno Taut in Turkey, as Sibel Bozdogan is doing now. But the point that I'd like to make is that when you do that kind of research and you start comparing, you start to see that there's a very different discourse taking place. The specificity is really critical here, because, for example, Corb is articulating all of this precisely within, the question of the East in Corb is articulated very much within what were, at least it seems to me, very normative writings about integration in French discourse about its colonies in North Africa. And it was a very different dynamic than that which was being spoken about by the British, who controlled Palestine, about which I've spoken not at all today, about whom I've spoken, even though it included really critical figures such as C.R. Ashby, if you ever heard the name, Lutyens, Herbert Baker, and a whole series of other people. But also, more importantly, with the Germans. There's a strange demographic that takes place here. These people who arrive on these shores as part of this wave in the mid-30s effectively are not at all familiar with this discoursive integration that would have been natural and already in the air for Corbusier in talking about the East. For them, in fact, the mimetic relation was not going to be about assimilation, but about a kind of inversion. They were really dialectical in their thinking. Yeah.
Maybe just one more.
Sure.
Could you try to although kind of maybe hopeless within its kind of context, but isn't that at least kind of laudable attempt to rethink what the problem of architecture is, rather than alignments permanently with supposed inert.
You're talking about some real objectivity, right? Some sort of material question that's going to be. You're not going to get that out of me because, first of all, because I've studied the techniques, and the techniques here are really remarkable, in the sense that they were essentially confounded with a really difficult truth as far as techniques is concerned. That in fact, climatic rationalism, if you believe in such a thing, had already perfected a Palestinian building type, which was infinitely cheaper, far better insulation, which is really a big issue, right? And and essentially managed to do a hell of a lot more. Now, in order to circumvent this, they have to speak about climatic rationality, but they end up having to essentially construct buildings which are irrevocably compromised because of that attempt. There's a discourse about climate, but in fact you discover that they're never insulated. They're built out of silicate brick, which is basically just sand stuck together. And so that ultimately the only thing that really bails them out, and it's really fascinating, is all of the principles of German housing planning of the existence minimum, because it allowed them to orient rooms properly so that it would be warm where you needed it to be warm at a certain time of the day and cold on the other, because you had no choice. You were not going to have the proper insulation which is necessary through massive stone construction. A last note about the techniques is that what's interesting here is that in fact in their construction, fundamentally in their construction, the modernist buildings were remarkably primitive by modern standards. They were hand-built. Arab workers, and that story is itself critical here. What was happening is that before all of the discourse about expulsion, there was an internal expulsion within Palestine as a result of land sales, which negated the previous practice of land sales during the Ottoman era. Before 1917, it was impossible to sell a large parcel of land in Palestine without keeping the inhabitants. Okay, this is what was called a system of the himaya, or the kind of a kind of prebendalism. If you bought land, you had responsibility towards the tenant farmers. Now, with the beginning of land purchases after World War I, you start having the Zionist Commission buy land, but only under the rule that essentially that get it empty. This created a huge displaced community that found essentially work and its life in these bidonvilles around Jewish cities, building these modernist structures by hand, dragging things up one by one, each block up and each piece, a little bit of cement in a bucket. So that effectively, if we're really going to talk about techniques, it really opens up another can of worms, right? Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps one more question.
Concerning this, the very situation you're talking about, the situation in Germany being reflected to Palestine, and then the situation of Palestine, which is sort of reconnect to our situation here. These initial situations you're talking about, where the thing sort of spreads out towards other field, are both very extreme. Is that just due to the strong dialectic within the process, or would you say that is some kind of just something which will?
Or is it me? Yeah.
No,
You can say it. Right.
No.
Yeah.
I'm just asking whether it's sort of due to these very extreme dialectic situations in which two components really sort of borrow each other's mask, or is it just a general principle?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I'm going to answer it very briefly and coyly right now, because I promise you that this is explicitly what I discuss in tomorrow's talk if you have a chance. But the answer to me is articulated in page 8 of, this is going to sound like a complete flunky, but it's articulated in page 8 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics, when he tells you that this is not a cogitative principle, it's an objective one. So yes, it's about the extremes, as far as in my interpretation.
Okay,
Thank you very much. Thank you.